Donald Trump has unquestionably cemented himself as one of the most culturally and politically relevant figures of the modern era. I don't think you'll find a single person who would deny the significant role he's played in the lives of each and every American for the past decade. But why let his inescapable presence in the media cause us to forget some of the more surreal side quests he embarked upon before assuming the most powerful office in the world, such as the time he entered into a beef with the late rapper Mac Miller, culminating with the latter trashing the then real estate developer on national TV.
I only have one thing to say. I hate you, Donald Trump.
Or his multiple cameos in films like Home Alone 2 and Zoolander. Or the time he tweeted out an epic rap battle of history and retweeted Killer Keemstar. These bizarre moments may seem entirely trivial considering the daunting authority he now wields as commander of the free world, and they are.
Here to sing the theme from Green Acres, please welcome Donald Trump and Will and Grace's Karen Walker.
Green Acres is the place to be. Farm living is the life for me. Land spreading out so far and wide. Keep Manhattan, just give me that countryside.
But they also may hold the key to understanding at least part of the reason why he landed that job in the first place. After all, if it weren't for the star power he honed on his long-running reality show, there's a decent chance the American people wouldn't have given his 2016 bid for the White House anything more than a passing glance. And he certainly may not have gained so much experience working the crowds at his rallies if it weren't for a little bit of practice he had with the WWE.
Indeed, yes. The Donald is here, live on Monday Night Raw.
If you're someone who only started paying serious attention to politics over the last couple election cycles, you may be completely unaware that Donald Trump was once formally inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame years before he ever set foot on the campaign trail. This came after he had hosted 2 WrestleManias back-to-back at Trump Hotel in the late 80s, and participated in a 2007 storyline that had him embracing the role of a babyface in the wrestling world before becoming a heel on the political stage. Having full reign to revel in his showmanship in front of a jeering live audience, Trump's repeated guest appearances on WWE's Monday Night Raw undoubtedly helped set the commander-in-chief down the path that would inevitably disrupt history forever. But none of these appearances would have been possible without the intervention of one man.
Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman of the WWE, Mr. McMahon!
To reduce Vince McMahon's title to mere a former owner of the WWE would be to diminish the greater responsibility he's had in shaping American culture as we know it. Throughout his 40-year reign that oversaw the monumental rise of superstars Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Hulk Hogan, John Cena, and so many others, Vince had an instrumental role in pushing professional wrestling far and beyond the lowbrow trash entertainment it was once taken for, and helped mold it into something far greater, an international phenomenon that helped forge the persona of a future US president.
I consider this to be my greatest honor of all.
If you grew up watching WWE in the 80s and 90s, you're probably already familiar with Vince McMahon's desire to monopolize professional wrestling at all costs, how he steamrolled the competition in an unending quest to become one of the richest and most formidable individuals on the planet. This story focuses on his journey to the top, highlights the morality he ignored to get there, and is reinforced by the testimonies of those he hurt. The families he tore apart, the relationships and careers he crushed, and in some cases, the lives he cut short. For too many years, his authority has gone unchecked. Only recently has his carefully crafted legacy been damaged in such a way that he may never recover from. And with a recent Netflix series doing little to genuinely grapple with the darker sides of that legacy, I think now is as appropriate a time as ever to take an honest look back at a career that was anything but inconsequential. This is the story of Vince McMahon.
New allegations have emerged involving WWE billionaire CEO Vince McMahon.
More famous than some of the wrestling stars he helped create.
You and God versus me.
Please welcome the chairman of WWE, Vince
As the world reeled from some of the worst man-made disasters in human history, Vince Kennedy McMahon was born on August 24th, 1945, in a small rural community located in Pinehurst, North Carolina, a place Vince would rarely acknowledge and never return to following the rise of his wrestling empire. His father, who was serving the US Coast Guard during World War II, would abandon Vince and his brother in his move to Washington, D.C. shortly after their birth. For a while, little was truly known about Vince's most formative years. He would tell riveting tales of his swashbuckling youth as if he were constantly causing trouble and always on the run from law enforcement, only for such stories to fall apart upon further scrutiny from journalists like Abraham Josephine Reisman, author of the best-selling biography Ringmaster, which I will be pulling from throughout this video. It seemed as though Vince McMahon wanted people to think he was a more rebellious child than he actually was, potentially in an attempt to mask an otherwise traumatic upbringing, which he alluded to in a 2001 interview with Playboy, hinting at being sexually abused by his mother Vicky. Despite him clearly telling the magazine it was a sensitive subject that he would rather not embellish, Vince was given a different treatment by shock jocks like Howard Stern, whose sensationalist interviews had no concern for maintaining boundaries.
I read in Playboy, I was shocked. Your mother, you're not in touch with because you said she molested you. That's got to be terrible.
I didn't say that. That was the inference.
Hold it.
Yeah.
Your mother is around and you don't talk to her.
Not a lot.
Boy, did she blow it, because, man, you're a billionaire.
Does she get any money from the WWF?
I just realized what I said. Did she blow it? That's the question.
Yeah, Howard Stern in those days was something else. And this was only 3 minutes into the interview. He was also subject to rampant physical abuse from his belligerent stepfather, Leo Lipton, during these early years as well. As the family bounced between trailer parks in the South, young Vinnie Lipton, as he was known at the time, was a world away from DC, where his biological father, Vincent James McMahon, was making a name for himself as a wrestling promoter during the 1950s. See, Vince Sr. had inherited the business from his father, Jess McMahon, founder of Capital Wrestling Co., later known as the World Wrestling Federation, which eventually became World Wrestling Entertainment after a 2002 lawsuit by the World Wildlife Fund, who had the initials first. Even now, with Vince Kennedy McMahon absent from the company following a wave of sexual assault allegations, which we will be discussing later, control of the multi-billion-dollar franchise had largely been in the hands of the McMahon family dynasty for generations, with Vince's daughter Stephanie being named CEO for a brief time in 2022. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Reisman's book is an excellent source on pretty much everything there is to know about Vince's childhood in particular. Interviewing countless old friends and family members, she writes about all things, from Vince's mother being said to perform in minstrel shows, to Vince's first sexual experience being between him and his cousin, the same cousin whom his stepfather Leo would later marry. There are plenty of anecdotes listed here in the first few chapters of Vince's life that are sure to raise some eyebrows, to say the least. And I would suggest you read the entire book if you get the chance, as it does go into more detail than we'll be able to cover here in this already incredibly long video. But one detail that surprised me the most is how Vinny wasn't even that much of a wrestling fan growing up. In fact, he didn't seem to be that interested at all. Now, of course, wrestling wasn't the behemoth it would become later on down the line for reasons that will become clear soon, but Vince wasn't even described as very athletic until he was older, and I found it fascinating that he was only drawn to the sport after he met his dad, a man with a kinder, warmer presence than any of the authority figures he had grown up with, telling one outlet that he instantly, quote, fell in love with Vince Sr. and became determined to win over his approval any way he could, splitting his teenage years between his segregated neighborhood of North Carolina and the upper echelons of our nation's capital, where Vince Sr. owned a massive home and was in constant contact with the wrestlers he promoted.
Dr. Jerry Graham gives Antonio Rocca a thorough examination explanation, but not the kind you usually expect from a doctor.
This is where Vince would reportedly meet another one of his idols, professional wrestler Jerry Graham. Now, when you look into Jerry Graham, you find a litany of wild testimony from his days in the limelight. Like one fabled story reported in Wrestling Observer that in 1970, a drunken Jerry barged into the home of Stu Hart, another legendary wrestler and promoter, and demanded he accompany him to his ex-wife's house to kidnap their daughter. As the story goes, Stu said no and advised against it, so Jerry went and found another wrestler, Abdullah the Butcher, to join him instead. When they got there, Jerry was attacked by his ex-wife's new husband, and the two wrestlers were promptly taken into custody, leaving Stu the task of bailing them out. Considering all that, I'd say it makes perfect sense why Vince Sr. didn't exactly want his son hanging out with the man, but despite his wishes, the younger Vince was very much drawn to Jerry's flashy, arrogantly crude demeanor, traveling around with him on occasion, and picking up some key insight into the industry he would soon dominate. That above all else, no matter how crazy things get, you must always protect the business. If you're not as familiar with professional wrestling, there is a term you need to know before we move forward. It's called kayfabe, with some believing it originated from a Pig Latin spelling of the word fake. That's exactly what it means. Fake, scripted, fictional, a work as it's known among wrestling circles. Kayfabe essentially applies to all wrestling matches that are planned out ahead of time, which happens to be all of them. In fact, wrestling kayfabe dates all the way back to the post-Civil War era, where traveling caravans of entertainers would script out wrestling matches in order to give the audience a more entertaining show. But you don't need me to tell you that these things have always been fake. There's a good chance that may have been the only thing you knew about wrestling before clicking on this video. But kayfabe was once considered sacred, at least among wrestlers and promoters. Reisman points out that it's impossible to know exactly how many wrestling fans have bought into kayfabe, if everyone watching knew it was completely fake to begin with, if people knew some parts were fake but thought others were real, or maybe they just knew it was all fake and wanted to pretend it was real. There's no scientific, tried and true method to gauge this phenomenon. And while the media has been exposing kayfabe for the past 100 years, for the first few decades of the WWF's existence, Vince did everything he could to maintain the veneer of authenticity, in fear that it would ruin the audience's interest in what they were doing, with even the slightest breach of kayfabe being enough to cause the entire industry to cave in on itself. At least that's what he told the wrestlers. As a result, the wrestlers were conditioned to give it their all when they were in the ring, and wrestling fans were conditioned not to disrespect their favorite performers by showing any indication that they knew it was all a work. Wrestlers have routinely described feeling addicted to the performance. No matter what it may have done for their long-term health, the rush they got from being cheered on by an adoring crowd was sometimes enough to ease the physical trauma. But wrestling wasn't always this popular. In fact, it's hard to say what the sport would look like today at all without the ruthless crusade of Vince Kennedy McMahon. Before the WWE became the global behemoth we all know it to be today, pro wrestling on this side of the world was originally broken down into smaller regional territories scattered across the United States and Canada. While they had all been held together by the National Wrestling Alliance, NWA, since 1948, each of these individual territories still had their own way of doing things. Because wrestling matches were hosted locally, communities enjoyed a more intimate bond with the wrestlers they watched on TV or in person. The WWE, or at this time the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, belonged to the territory system as well. During the era of Vince Sr., it was confined to the northeastern sect of America and was considered the glittery crown jewel of the NWA. While the territory system was in no means perfect, with Reisman comparing the NWA to a wrestling cartel and Jacobin columnist Dan O'Sullivan likening it to the Mafia, the old way of doing things was incredibly flawed, but still had a few perks. For example, if a wrestler didn't like how business was being conducted over here in the Pacific Northwest, well, then they could pretty easily try their luck over here at Detroit's big-time wrestling promotion instead. Even if the pay was shit in both of these areas, since NWA promoters conspired with one another to keep labor costs as low as possible and worked on a highly coercive business model, this was still seen as preferable to what came next. There is an undisputed history of corruption during this time of NWA dominance that we just don't have the time to explore here, but the key thing to remember right now is that the National Wrestling Alliance was maintained by a strict, unspoken code of non-interventionism. As long as you didn't infringe on somebody else's turf, all was right in the world. But Vince wasn't about world peace. Without the knowledge of the general public, Vince had made a secret arrangement to purchase the WWF from his father in the summer of 1982 for $1 million, a payment he made sure to follow through on. But where exactly did young Vinny come up with all that money? After all, he was just a lowly announcer, at least on paper. People have their theories, but as sports historian and former WWF manager Jim Cornette went on to assert, Senior allowed his son to foot the bill using the company's profits, so long as he didn't miss a payment for a full year.
Vince agreed to buy Capital Wrestling, the old WWF, from his father, Vince Sr., for, what was it, $1 million, and he had to make quarterly payments, and if at any point he didn't make the payments or it wasn't paid off on the appropriate time, it would revert back to his dad. But it was a promotion and a business that was already ongoing and having a hot period, and so he just stepped in and used the money off the towns that was already coming in to make the payments, and didn't have to actually spend any of his own money if he indeed had any at that time.
So there's a case to be made that Vince got the company for free. Either way, the passing of the torch had less to do with merit and everything to do with keeping the business squarely in the family. It's not like he had really done much to prove his worth. Working under his father, a 28-year-old Vinny had previously facilitated a handful of failed vanity projects that ended in huge embarrassment, including a botched stunt by Evel Knievel that was widely panned, and a fight with Muhammad Ali in Japan, where, according to wrestler Freddie Blassie, Vince had proposed staging a match which would involve assaulting Ali with a razor blade without his consent. Blading, where one wrestler discreetly slices their own skin with a razor during a fight to draw blood, is a tradition that was commonly encouraged throughout the WWE's history. Now, with Senior's formal approval and his increasingly failing health, Vinny was officially handed over the mechanisms of power in 1983, and thus the total authority to go where no man before him had ever dared, invade the other territories and make himself the sole promoter of professional wrestling.
Years ago, I took on every wrestling promoter throughout North America. I kicked every one of their asses.
It would be decades before Vince McMahon fully embraced the cartoonishly evil Mr. McMahon caricature of himself on national TV. But even in these early days, he was beginning to establish himself as a real-life heel, someone to be hated by hardcore wrestling fans. Initially getting under the skin of wrestling purists by booking his own WWF wrestlers to perform in smaller territories that had grown accustomed to seeing their regional heroes perform exclusively. Polygon even dug up this letter an incensed fan had submitted to the Wrestling Observer newsletter in 1984, labeling Vince a, quote, real threat to the stability of pro wrestling, which obviously was doing quite well until he decided to overrun the sport like Hannibal. See, Vince McMahon wasn't just gunning for the top spot, he wanted the WWF to be the only spot in town. So he became hellbent on bringing the other territories to their knees, whether that meant poaching their talent, taking up their airspace, or just buying the rival territories outright. Nothing was off the table. Within the matter of a few years, Vince's relentless ambition and shrewd business instincts had managed to stomp out nearly all competition, and as a result, pro wrestling was never the same. The period that immediately followed became known as the Golden Age of the WWF and lasted from about 1984 to 1993. After decades of being written off by those on the outside, Vince was able to bring the genre out from the shadows and into the forefront of mainstream attention by roping well-respected musicians like Cyndi Lauper and Hollywood heavyweights like Mr. T into his intricately woven and provocative storylines, of which he basically had total creative direction of of, Vince had made the WWF and the stars that dominated it inescapable. Names like Andre the Giant, Macho Man Randy Savage, and of course the All-American Hulk Hogan were rapidly becoming national icons. Even if you've never watched wrestling a day in your life, you absolutely know the term Hulkamania and would instantly recognize the roided up blonde beast behind it. Part of that has to do with the fact that Vince wasn't just confining his talent to the ring, Vince was booking his athletes on primetime late night slots, using their likeness for toys, lunchboxes, bed sheets, and even bringing their characters to the world of Sunday morning cartoons, with the launch of Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling in 1985. The children's show featured a litany of the WWF's top roster embarking on non-wrestling adventures. But if you actually go back and watch it, you'll see that none of these wrestlers were actually voiced by their real-life counterparts.
Andre, I'm stuck!
This was also around the same time that Vince began to trademark his talent's wrestling names, which prevented them from taking their iconic personas elsewhere, and gave Vince the utmost control over their marketability. As Reisman put it, quote, "The humans who portrayed these characters, who sweated and bled for the WWF, were now reduced to intellectual property, neutered, portable, and, in the case of the cartoon, quite literally two-dimensional. Vince was building a world in which labor was entirely subservient not just to an individual boss, but to what Americans would come to call a brand." In 2019, John Oliver did a whole episode on the WWE's grisly workplace conditions, specifically zeroing in on Vince's practice of hiring wrestlers as independent contractors, thereby avoiding the need to provide any health insurance, paid family leave, retirement accounts, travel expenses, social security, unemployment insurance, and workman's comp to the many men and women who destroy their bodies on a daily basis to line his wallet. Not to mention that there is no off-season, and that the WWE has historically been the only game in town. So it's not like these guys have had much of a choice but to agree to Vince's terms. As far as the big man himself is concerned, quote, "Anyone who makes the kind of money that they make can easily afford their own health care," according to him. As Jacobin's Dan O'Sullivan argues, though, wrestling icon Bret Hart might beg to differ. In his 2014 article, O'Sullivan illustrates an in-ring accident that caused Hart to miss several weeks of work, but when Hart could no longer support his family on the couple $100 a week he had been getting from the WWF, Hart was forced to return to wrestling early, after already having to pay his medical bills out of pocket. O'Sullivan theorizes that this might have been the point all along, considering how much the WWF stood to gain by having one of their star wrestlers back in the ring as soon as possible. The worst part is these wrestlers are extremely aware of the fact that they're being taken advantage of. There just hasn't been much they can do about it. It's not like they haven't tried. Former wrestler turned governor of Minnesota, Jesse Ventura, once sought to address these harrowing conditions by attempting to unionize his fellow wrestlers in 1984, only to be immediately shut down by his boss.
Because when I was in wrestling in the 80s, I tried to unionize wrestling. And it was Hulk Hogan who cut my legs out from under me. Hulk Hogan went to Vince McMahon, ratted me out, and subsequently later on cost me my job.
I mean, if there's any job on the planet that needs a union, it's probably the one that involves getting slammed in the head by a metal chair and being routinely pulverized by giant human beings hundreds of nights out of the year. Because, oh my god, these guys work and travel constantly, with one anonymous wrestler telling Jacobin, quote, "To be at work from, let's say, noon until when the show's over, which could be midnight, that's a 12-hour day. But then you also have to drive to the next town, which could be 300 miles away." Another former wrestler by the name of Levi Cooper also told the publication that around $70,000 of his $250,000 paycheck is immediately eaten up by travel expenses and the clothing and equipment he needs to perform, telling the magazine, quote, "I was doing well, right? Like, I'm taking home about 175 grand or 180 grand a year, but I also missed probably 250 out of the 365 days of my young daughter's life during that time span." As Oliver also pointed out, because they have no guaranteed retirement retirement funds, many wrestlers have to continue coming back to the ring even later on in life when they're way past their physical prime, just in order to keep the lights on.
Rowdy Roddy Piper continued wrestling into his 40s and 50s, and just listen to him explain why.
Wrestling it has a tremendous entrance plan. You come in as, boy, here you are. You rock and roll and everything's wonderful. It's got no exit plan.
But at the same time that Vince was purging his federation of any sentiments of unionization that may have been bubbling up, the WWF was making money hand over fist. In 1985, the WWF pulled in a grand total of $63 million, a 113% increase from the previous year's earnings of $29 million, a number that continued to go up throughout the rest of the decade, hitting an eye-watering $144 million in 1990. But it's hard to imagine this swift increase happening without Vince pushing wrestling into a new category of what he coined sports entertainment, involving rich storylines that would be more akin to a soap opera mixed with intentional edge and over-the-top shock value. The plot lines were intended to be outrageous, and if he wasn't writing the scripts himself as the new official owner, Vince always had the ultimate say in what was being broadcast. Let's just say he wasn't very liberal about the rules.
When it comes to me, there ain't no difference between black or white.
Before you ask, yes, the WWF did sell action figures of Rowdy Roddy Piper in half blackface. This one's even signed. Well, of course, the vast majority of these storylines teetered more on the goofy and absurd rather than the diabolical and racially insensitive. Vince would occasionally suppress whatever morals he may have possessed in order to draw as many eyes onto his creation as possible. And that sometimes involved playing off real-world conflicts. But before we get to that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about today's sponsor, Saily. There's a bunch of people making noise above me in my apartment. I'm sorry about that. So my girlfriend actually has a real job, and sometimes she has to take business trips for that real job. And because I can use FaceApp from anywhere in the country, I tend to go with her. Just recently, we made the trip out to beautiful San Jose, California, where I took mostly accidental pictures of the ground because I don't know how to use a camera apparently. But despite being in the literal heart of Silicon Valley, I didn't have Wi-Fi for the majority of the trip. It was great. That wouldn't have happened if I had used Saily. With Saily, you can choose from several affordable eSIM plans in over 190 countries and 8 regions, keeping you connected to the internet whenever and wherever you travel. It's even better if you're traveling abroad, since you only need to download it once. You don't need to keep installing new eSIMs in every country you visit. No more waiting in line at the airport to get a local SIM card. With Saily, you save time and get to avoid scammers selling fake SIM cards outside train stations and airports. All you gotta do is download the Saily app on your phone, select the data plan that best fits you, and enter my coupon code JAWBRY to get an exclusive 15% off discount on your plan. Just click the link in the description below or go to saily.com/jawbry and use code JAWBRY at checkout. It supports the channel, and I guarantee you'll have a much easier time on the next trip you take. Huge thanks again to Saily for sponsoring this video, and now back to the horrors.
This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. A tearful Shah of Iran left his country today on a vacation from which he may never return.
On January 16th, 1979, the US-backed Shah of Iran permanently fled the country he had led with an iron fist for about 38 years. During that time, the monarchy had spurred severe criticism for allowing American companies to get rich off Iranian oil, strengthening wealth inequality, and leaving the Iranian people unable to reap the full benefits of the black gold their land procured. Political dissidents were often tortured and killed, which only strengthened local support for the resistance led by the Islamic Republic. After the Shah sought medical treatment for lymphoma in the US later that year, Iranian student revolutionaries responded by storming the American embassy, taking hostages, and demanding the extradition of the Shah so he could stand trial for his crimes. What followed was a 444-day period of tension and chaos between the two nations, where American embassy employees would tragically remain until being safely released in 1981. During and immediately following the crisis, anti-Iranian sentiment in the US skyrocketed to a new high. Iranian Americans, and even Arab Americans who had nothing to do with Iran, were subject to a tragic reality where they were often assumed sympathetic to anti-American ideals based off appearance alone. And as I've discussed in other videos, where there is popular sentiment permeated against a particular demographic, there will be people who seek to take advantage of it. Vince McMahon is one of those people. In the early 80s, Vince McMahon devised a plethora of storylines that involved an Iranian wrestler by the name of the Iron Sheik. Previously wrestling under the name The Great Hussein Arab, the Sheik would occasionally speak in a made-up gibberish that was supposed to be vaguely Persian, I guess, and sometimes wielded an ancient Persian club. He was a favorite among audiences, but to critics, the Iron Sheik embodied the walking stereotype of a foreign adversary the audience loved to hate. He was scripted as an unapologetic Ayatollah sympathizer, and it wasn't uncommon to see him face off against such patriotic heroes as Hulk Hogan and, at that time, the beloved Sergeant Slaughter, who donned the persona of a US drill sergeant before becoming a heel just in time for the Gulf War in 1990.
This is, something is happening outside. The skies over Baghdad have been illuminated. We're seeing bright flashes going off all over the sky.
Similarly to how he responded to the Iran hostage crisis, Vince made sure to capitalize on the new Persian War by having Sergeant Slaughter dramatically denounce his support for the United States and throw himself squarely behind the Ba'athist government of Saddam Hussein in a dramatic twist of fate, boldly stating, quote, "Saddam Hussein did not invade Kuwait, he conquered Kuwait, and his name overnight became a household one around the world." He said this in front of what you can imagine was a disgusted American audience, chanting USA, USA. And believe me, the WWF went all out in their portrayal of Slaughter as this evil Iraqi warmonger who had been turned away from the Western world due to the American government's weakness in the region. They even photoshopped a photo of Slaughter standing next to Saddam Hussein, leading to a mountain of death threats that required Slaughter to walk around with a bulletproof vest in public, flanked with constant security. Vince even brought the Sheik back into the mix, who, despite being Iranian, debuted a new Iraqi character in 1991, Colonel Mustafa. Now, keep in mind, the Sheik's home country of Iran had literally just been involved in a brutal war with Iraq that saw the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iranians minimum. But that didn't stop Vince from turning the Sheik against his own ethnicity. Kayfabe was king, and Vince wanted to give the audience a show they could really get invested in. Drawing on the pervasive hyper-nationalism of the era, the storyline eventually culminated with the Star-Spangled Hulk Hogan successfully triumphing over his Iraqi rivals at the 1991 WrestleMania, ripping up the Iraqi flag to thunderous applause. The Gulf War ended in a matter of months, with American casualties in the hundreds and Iraqi casualties estimated in the hundreds of thousands during and in the aftermath of the invasion that brought Iraq back to the pre-industrial age, according to a 1991 UN report that labeled the bombing campaign, quote, near apocalyptic. But believe it or not, this wasn't the last time Vince would exploit a war the United States was engaged in. In fact, it wasn't the last time he'd exploit a war with Iraq. When tragedy strikes, Vince sees dollar signs. And if history is any indicator, we know that the former owner has never met a national tragedy he couldn't bring into the ultra-sensationalist spotlight of kayfabe. In stark contrast to the NFL, MLB, NCAA, and countless other sports organizations that chose to delay their schedules, Vince McMahon made the bold decision to move forward with the WWF's regular broadcast of SmackDown on September 13th, 2001, just 2 days after the largest attack on U.S. soil since Pearl Harbor. The Texas-based event was billed as the first public gathering of this caliber since the atrocities of 9/11, and Vince used his opening monologue to thank first responders and pay tribute to the families of those who had been lost. Many other wrestlers joined suit, and the show went down as an overall pretty respectful display of unity, but I think we all know the WWE well enough by now. Decorum may have been the one thing it lacked, and it was only a matter of time before Vince would go back on his calls for unity and normalcy to instead snatch the low-hanging fruit once again. Enter one of the most controversial heels in the history of the WWE. In 2004, wrestling fans were introduced to a man who went by the name of Muhammad Hassan. Donning a keffiyeh and proudly celebrating his Palestinian Jordanian descent, Muhammad became known for his unusual approach to the WWE's portrayal of Arabs. He would constantly try and get viewers to understand the bigotry and racism that he and other Muslims experienced on a daily basis in a post-9/11 world. Only his name wasn't Muhammad Hassan, it was Mark Capani, and Mark wasn't Arab at all. He was an Italian-American from Syracuse, New York. I have no idea how anyone ever took this guy to be Middle Eastern in the first place. That's the whitest-looking Italian I've seen in my life. And the name Muhammad Hassan is just stunning, frankly. Then on top of that, the organization made him have his debut in Alabama. They were just setting him up. Having a guy who drew attention to the unimaginable harassment Arab Americans faced during this particularly nasty and strange era of American culture isn't really a bad idea on its face. The problem is you undercut that entire message by having the messenger not actually Arab. And in addition to all of that, they made him a heel. Here was this guy trying to spread a positive message in theory, but was walking out to jeers and boos from an audience waving American flags not even a year after his official debut. But that's Vince McMahon's hubris for you. He just couldn't help himself. Obviously, a heel turn like this shouldn't come as much of a surprise from Vince, but what came next was truly shocking. Up against The Undertaker in July 2005, the Italian would start praying in the middle of the match and call upon a team of his friends draped in menacing black outfits paired with camo pants, who all beat the dead man into submission using a barrage of tactics which included the camel clutch, the Iron Sheik's famous finisher. As written by Omar Salah on fanbyte.com, quote, "The WWE had once again taken the safer option by turning an Arab American Muslim character with understandable gripes against Islamophobia into a full-on terrorist caricature. It was another instance of their eagerness to play into a white audience's fears about marginalized people, which they have an egregiously long track record of doing. An episode like this was never going to age particularly well, but it certainly couldn't have aired at a worse time. Immediately after the brutal 7/7 terrorist bombings in London that left 56 dead and hundreds injured. While the segment was recorded before the attack, the backlash was swift and severe, and it didn't take long for the WWE to pull Mark off the airwaves. All these years later, he's still seen by some wrestling fans as a man ahead of his time, but to some Muslim fans like Omar, the Muhammad Hassan name will go down as yet another extreme manifestation of Vince McMahon's endless desire to peddle outrage to the masses. See, Vince McMahon relied on more than just global conflicts and racially charged storylines, although that was a lot of it, whether it was Japanese manager Wally Yamaguchi threatening to, quote, choppy Val Venus's pee-pee off with a samurai sword, or the dreaded Mexicool trio riding into the ring on Juan Deere tractors, or the wrestler JBL tracking down illegal immigrants at the Mexican Mexican border, let's just say people weren't looking towards professional wrestling for sensitive observations of society at large. And perhaps no one was more aware of that fact than Vince himself, who went out of his way to lean harder into the seedier throes of his mind than ever before, with the inauguration of the Attitude Era in the late 90s. The same highly publicized era that defined childhoods across the nation and saw the rise of superstars like The Rock, Triple H, and Stone Cold Steve Austin, an alumni of my university, by the way, go Eagles, also birthed some of the most notorious, depraved, and outright morally bankrupt moments in the history of the organization. It was called the Attitude Era for a reason, as it basically pit bad guys against even worse guys, as put by New Yorker columnist Vincent Cunningham. I could probably make an entire video dedicated to the Attitude Era alone. In fact, other YouTubers have done just that. But because I still want to keep this video as focused on Vince McMahon as humanly possible, which is already hard to do when the WWE is a whole separate world of its own that needs explaining, let's just take a moment here to showcase a few highlights marked by Vince's fingerprints.
Blessed be the name of Vincent Kennedy McMahon.
In 1996, at the height of Brian Pillman's heated feud with Stone Cold, audiences were shown a recording of the latter breaking into Brian's home where he was confronted by a gun pointed directly at his head. After gunshots rang out, the segment abruptly ended, leaving fans all over the nation in an uproar. When advertisers pulled out and angry parents complained to the network, the WWF came very close to losing their coveted spot on national television. They were forced to make an apology and promise that things would be toned down going forward. But I think you already know how that went.
You know, the point you talked about the limo explosion, when we saw that.
What kills me is so many people call. I mean, the office next day, like, people, I'm not kidding you, like, and they'll probably be mad at me for saying, like, Trump called, and it was like, did something happen to Vince?
Like, did Trump not understand that that was a skit?
In 1998, the WWF was slammed by religious activists after The Undertaker physically tied Austin to a wooden cutout of his wrestling symbol in an act that seemed to depict a makeshift crucifixion. That same year, the female wrestler Sable made an appearance at Fully Loaded, wearing nothing but shorts and painted handprints over her breasts. In one of Vince's most brazen attempts to appeal to sex value, he ended up pissing off plenty of parents once again. In 2002, during a storyline that accused wrestler Kane of killing his ex-girlfriend Katie Vick in a car accident, his opponent Triple H came under fire for wearing a Kane mask and acting out sex with a mannequin of Katie inside an open casket. According to several insiders behind the storyline, including Triple H, the segment was filmed at a real funeral home with an actual funeral happening in the next room over. As Triple H stated in an interview with Opie and Anthony in 2008, as Vince kept demanding he moan louder and louder, the noises became so disruptive that the funeral director had to get involved.
Now, the whole way, I'm like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, but so the whole way there, I'm trying to, like, convince him, Vince, we really got to make this funny. Like, this has to be very funny. Like, I'm really making a joke out of this. No, it needs to be dark, and it needs to.
No.
And we literally go to a funeral home where we rent out one of the rooms. We have a casket with a dummy in it. Have the guy that is eventually going to be my father-in-law yelling at me to have sex louder with the dummy in the coffin. And while we're doing this, I'm in a skin-colored thong on top of a dummy in a coffin. In a funeral home, and the guy from the funeral home, the mortician guy, opens up the door, sticks his head in, and he's like, "Could you guys keep it down? I got a funeral."
Between Big Boss Man feeding Al Snow his dog, Mark Henry making the claim that he had slept with his own sister, and the 77-year-old Mae Young giving birth to a disembodied human hand, one of the most nauseating storylines devised in the dark confines of Vince's mind never actually made it to air, and went almost completely unknown until the recent Netflix documentary, where it was revealed by Stephanie McMahon that her father wanted to use her real-life pregnancy as a kayfabe plot point. The big reveal being that Vince McMahon had impregnated his own daughter. According to Stephanie, this was the second time she ever had to tell her father no to a storyline. I can only imagine what the first time was, and even after she shot him down, Vince's next idea was to make his son, Stephanie's own brother, the kayfabe father of her baby. This also went nowhere, but I'd say it pretty adequately outlines Vince's complete and utter lack of moral boundaries when it came to writing something that would garner attention. If we've learned anything by taking a glimpse at the Attitude Era, it's that Vince McMahon would stop at nothing to put butts in seats, to turn the sport of pro wrestling into a deranged spectacle, so far removed from what it had once been under his father's control. Perhaps the most significant step in this direction came when Vince made himself the ultimate heel of his own federation. And yes, that's where we get absolutely wild clips like Stone Cold beating a hospitalized Vince McMahon to a pulp, Vince demanding other female wrestlers get on their hands and knees and bark for him, and Vince pushing wheelchair-bound children to their doom. I guess it's better than eating a wheelchair-bound child, which he's reportedly stated is human instinct, by the way. But Vince's kayfabe persona, the dreaded and cruel Mr. McMahon who ruled over his wrestling empire with a heavy hand, was totally different from the real-life Vince McMahon who also ruled over his wrestling empire with a heavy hand. I mean, despite what he liked to say, it was hard to argue that Vince wasn't living out some kind of perverse, egotistical actualization of himself when he, launched the Kiss My Ass Club in 2001, where Vince's real-life employees were made to demonstrate their respect and loyalty by carrying out the humiliating task of pressing their lips against their boss's bare ass cheeks in front of a roaring live crowd.
This is the greatest moment in the history of the WWE!
And if you thought we were done with the incest undertones, sorry to say, Vince also got his own son to join the club when Shawn Michaels pressed the unconscious face of Shane McMahon against his father's behind. Don't really know what else to say here other than just be glad I can't show you the footage. Vince clearly had no restraint and would much rather let his most depraved ideas run wild in the ring as opposed to, not making out with another woman in front of his wife. That's right, everybody, the current US Secretary of Education. By embracing this outrageous comic book-like villain inside the ring, Vince McMahon was very quickly establishing himself as one of the most hated sports franchise owners in the country. But Vince was about to take his notoriety far and beyond the field of pro wrestling. In fact, he was about to make his grand debut on an actual field for the first time in his life.
This is the XFL!
In 1998, the National Football League had become such an immensely lucrative entity that they demanded $500 million from NBC, which had carried the league since 1939. But the president of NBC Sports, Dick Ebersol, let them walk. As a result, the league was split. CBS got the AFC and Fox Sports landed the NFC, which meant NBC had some airspace it needed to fill.
Well, and so the end of the 1997 NFL season, and for NBC Sports, Super Bowl 32 is the end of our 32 years covering AFL, NFL action.
Well, as luck would have it, one of Dick Ebersol's closest friends, Vince McMahon, was in the market for a network to host his own league, the XFL, which was meant as a competitor to the NFL. See, Vince ultimately had plans to give football fans something to watch in the offseason once the Super Bowl ended in February. He also felt that the NFL had gotten a bit too soft in recent years, what with their pesky safety regulations and other useless shit. In Vince's eyes, the sport had been neutered and was in desperate need of an extreme overhaul. Being the trailblazing disruptor that had transformed wrestling, he figured that by teaming up with Dick, who had already helped land WrestleMania, a recurring slot on NBC, and was at that point considered the most powerful man in sports, the XFL was poised to give the NFL a real run for its money.
We will take you places where the NFL is afraid to take you. Because quite frankly, we're not afraid of anything. Where's my smash mouth wide open football? It's gone. I guarantee you that the XFL will not be an overregulated antiseptic brand of ball. Some suggest that the NFL stands for the No Fun League. The XFL is going to be the Extra Fun League.
What followed was an intense media blitz that hyped up the XFL as this ruthless, violent alternative to the traditional football we'd all seen in the NCAA and NFL. One ad even contained players getting knocked to the ground by a fucking wrecking ball. Vince billed this thing as a revolutionary, larger-than-life new venture, complete with a whole new set of teams and mascots. They hired new talent and already established NFL players alike. Even Jesse Ventura was brought on board as an announcer while he was acting governor of Minnesota. Vince was willing to pull out all of the stops to make this thing work. He made a series of dramatic rule changes to differentiate it from the NFL, like having players fight for the ball as opposed to doing a coin toss. He allowed players to write inflammatory statements on the backs of their jerseys as opposed to a player's last name. It wasn't uncommon to see the words Big Daddy, Death Blow, or He Hate Me plastered on the Jumbotron.
Raw, smart, running back, WKU, West Kentucky University, and they hate me, baby. They hate me.
You know, they can put any name they want on the back of their jersey, so you got nicknames, you got everything out there.
I know you got nicknames, but that seems to be a phrase.
He hate me.
He hate me. Don't be a player hater.
Who hates him?
Everybody apparently.
You?
He.
Oh, he.
Plus, the camera angles resembled something out of a Madden game, and the players were constantly mic'd up. While the NFL would actually go on to borrow both of these practices later on, it did lead to some pretty questionable moments that I'm sure the network and advertisers weren't the happiest about. Vince also made sure that cameramen were showing off the cheerleaders' provocative outfits as much as humanly possible, and would even encourage sideline reporters and other XFL employees to engage in on-air PDA with the cheerleaders as much as they could. Not to mention the pay was shit, and in typical Vince McMahon fashion, the players weren't given any semblance of health insurance. So, of course, it goes without saying that the XFL had its fair share of critics, both in the lead up to the first game and throughout its 2001 season. Football fans had concerns that Vince may try to script the games just like he did with wrestling, and seasoned sports commentators like Bob Costas made a concerted effort to stay as far away from the XFL as possible. Having his own set of doubts from the start, Costas was always more than happy to take shots at Vince's new pet project on national television. If the stakes weren't already high enough, though, Vince had already sunk $250 million of his own dollars into the league. So needless to say, he really needed a miracle here. But I guess all that promo worked, because the first game of the XFL became the most watched primetime debut for a sports league in broadcasting history, totaling a 9.5 score in the Nielsen ratings and a whopping 14 million live viewers.
This was wonderful. We're thrilled. I mean, we have had a blast doing this, with working with Dick again and Basil DeVito putting this thing together in such a short period of time. No human could have ever done that except Basil. You know, and we've had it's been a wonderful trip. It's a lot of fun, and I'm not that difficult to find in terms of the media.
We're on to a
as
sold
Rob
out.
would say, just bring it.
We're on to a sold-out stadium in San Francisco in an hour.
Yeah.
As far as the sheer numbers looked, the XFL was a smash hit, but little did Vince know at the time, having so many eyes on that very first game may not have been so much of a good thing in the end. And that's because the game itself was boring as shit. If you go back and actually watch this thing, you'll see what looks like a high school game played by only backups, which is not exactly what you want for your all-new, earth-shattering, ball-wrecking, no-holds-barred circus attraction that this thing was packaged as.
Marcus Hinton couldn't hang on, but yes, there is a flag on the play. Underthrown and incomplete.
Bad throw that time.
No white shirts even close.
And that's throwing into triple coverage. Come on, quarterback.
Whether the poor performance had to do with the lack of top-tier talent, the non-existent chemistry between team members, too many players getting injured at the very beginning of the game trying to scramble for who gets the ball first,
Well, I'll tell you what, we have sustained our first injury of the night on the scramble for the ball king.
or a mix of all of those things, the XFL put on a wholly underwhelming performance in front of the largest audience it would ever get. Because after that initial game, numbers began to drop considerably. People didn't want to waste their time time on a watered-down version of the sport they already loved, which was, ironically, the exact opposite thing they had been anticipating, even as Vince ratcheted up the ante. In one particular act of desperation, Vince invited the camera crew inside the cheerleaders' locker room, where we get a bizarre, dreamlike sequence of half-naked dancing cheerleaders interrupted when a half-naked Rodney Dangerfield pops out of a stall.
Hey, where's my wife? I can hear my wife. Where is she?
But Vince stuck by his unique new creation for as long as he could, airing out his grievances with Costas during an in-person interview that almost devolved into a full-on wrestling match of its own.
You want to let me finish here for a second, pal? Shut your mouth and let me answer the question, all right? I'll be happy to answer. You got a situation that you don't know what you're talking about.
For all of his passion or combativeness, Vince was sorely unable to save his Extreme Football League from being flushed down the toilet. With one lone season generating a loss of $50 million, the XFL shuttered its operations in 2002. In hindsight, maybe the giant XFL blimp that crashed into an Oakland restaurant 3 days before the league's official debut wasn't the most promising omen in the world, actually. Since then, there have been multiple attempts at a revamp. In 2020, Vince managed to relaunch the XFL on ESPN and Fox, only to have COVID shut it back down just 5 weeks into the season. A few years later, in 2023, Dwayne Johnson bought the league for $15 million and turned it into the UFL, which is currently underway today. To cap this segment off on a somewhat positive note, their last season wasn't totally unimpressive, and there's a good chance it could go somewhere in the coming years with the right guidance and proper overhead. But it will certainly not be doing so with any further input from Vince McMahon.
In the last 30 minutes, the founder of WWE has resigned from the board that owns the company after a former employee accused him of sexual assault and trafficking.
For years, Vince McMahon was considered invincible. Only over the past couple of years has his impenetrable status as the most powerful man in wrestling been challenged. Not by some massive institution or any equally powerful threat, but by a few lone women who dared speak out against a culture of abuse and brutality. We will be discussing these allegations in detail soon enough, but first, we need to establish the track record of previous controversies that just about took Vince down. I'm not talking about some fringe parent advocates mad about a gun being shown on TV. What I'm referring to goes far beyond the theatrical gimmicks of kayfabe. In fact, as we're about to see, sometimes that very fakeness is the shield Vince uses to keep his own industry of exploitation afloat.
Too often, this is what it seems like in Washington. But to get things done, you've got to work together. I teamed up with Joe Lieberman to make college more affordable for low-income families. And Barbara Boxer and I wrote a law protecting open space. I'm even working with Hillary Clinton to limit inappropriate material in children's video games, because it makes more sense to wrestle with America's problems than with each other. I'm Rick Santorum, and I approve this message.
This is Rick Santorum, a former GOP presidential candidate and lawmaker who served as the third-ranking member of his party in the Senate during the last few years of his career before stepping down from Congress in 2007 to join a conservative think tank. Before becoming a heavyweight in the realm of Republican politics, Rick Santorum cut his teeth in the 80s as an associate with the Pennsylvania-based law firm Kirkpatrick & Lockhart, which is where Santorum, a self-described wrestling fan, found himself a very lucrative client in 1987. See, this was in the midst of his crusade against the territories, and in order to beat them, Vince knew that he needed the WWF to get crazier. But in order for him to broadcast all of the insane shit we've already looked at, he would need to significantly gut state safety regulations. This meant reclassifying his operation as sports entertainment, rather than a legitimate sports franchise subject to all kinds of rules, precautions, and basically reduce as much overhead from the government as possible. It meant getting the Pennsylvania Athletic Commission out of the WWF's hair. Rick Santorum was tasked with doing just that. This is where we first see Vince McMahon drop the veneer of kayfabe in any meaningful way. And he did so for one very specific reason. As written in Mother Jones, quote, by freely admitting that wrestling wasn't a legitimate athletic contest, McMahon was able to make the case that it shouldn't be held to the same regulatory standards as sports. Before the 1980s, most wrestling was under the jurisdiction of state athletic commissions, which were responsible for levying taxes, providing referees, and ensuring basic medical precautions. Santorum was the legal muscle involved in bringing Vince's ultimate goal to fruition, and he gave a new air of legitimacy to what Vince was trying to accomplish. Smitten by getting to work with the man whose father shaped his childhood, Santorum was more than happy to do anything and everything to prove to the politicians that the PA Athletic Commission was nothing more than a useless bureaucracy that quote-unquote raped promoters like Vince. Santorum's words, not mine. After a campaign that saw Santorum literally bribing state officials with WWF tickets, food, booze, and a backstage access to stars like Hulk Hogan, Vince and co. had succeeded. As a result of Santorum's critical deregulation push, the WWF no longer needed to pay taxes on its broadcasts. Wrestlers weren't legally obligated to take physical examinations before exhibitions anymore, and the state was no longer required to provide timekeepers, announcers, or doctors to make sure everything ran smoothly. Those responsibilities now fell onto Vince. Instead of acknowledging how this change could theoretically lead to further abuse within a system already rife with it, Santorum brilliantly argued at the time that less regulation would only incentivize Vince to take better care of his wrestlers by hiring the doctors they really needed. I don't think I need to tell you that an overhaul like this would indirectly lead to even more corruption within the system. Because why would it not? The obvious problem being that Vince McMahon was far more interested in profit than protecting the general health and well-being of his talent. I mean, he wasn't giving them healthcare, as we all know, and they could certainly have used it. Turns out, years of getting clobbered in the head might actually push someone towards substances to mitigate the physical and emotional pain of being in an industry built on fear and brutality. It's not hard to see why alcohol and pills would be just as common as food and water in the WWF during the 80s and 90s, and it shouldn't be hard to imagine why so many of these wrestlers would turn to steroids to juice themselves up before a big match. I mean, why shouldn't they?
But the things that I am not is I'm not a steroid abuser, and I do not use steroids.
But Hulk Hogan's former teammates have a very different story to tell about his past abuse of steroids.
I myself personally have injected Hulk Hogan with anabolic steroids.
And it isn't just their word against his. Dr. George Zahorian was the ringside physician for the Pennsylvania Athletic Commission. Last June, he went on trial for illegally selling steroids to professional wrestlers.
Once Santorum had successfully lobbied the government to loosen its grip on the WWF, which wasn't very strong to begin with, let's be clear, author Irvin Muchnick states Vince and his wife Linda were quick to retain a ringside physician whose flagrant malpractice would soon land him behind bars. According to one court deposition acquired by Mother Jones, Dr. Greg Zahorian III once defended his reputation for happily dishing out steroids and other illegal substances to wrestlers by stating, "The boys need their candies." Yeah, those candies almost led to the collapse of the World Wrestling Federation in the early 90s, when the federal government came knocking. According to WrestlingInc.com, Linda McMahon sent out an internal memo in December 1989, raising concerns of an upcoming federal investigation into Zahorian's abuses. In this memo, that wasn't revealed until Linda's 2010 Senate run, the McMahon matriarch allegedly instructed executives, quote, to call Zahorian and tell him not to come to any more of our events, and also clue him in on any action that the Justice Department is thinking of taking. According to federal prosecutors, someone inside the company, possibly Pat Patterson, then ordered Zahorian to begin destroying evidence of his relationship with the WWF. So it shouldn't be surprising that federal agents found Zahorian in the process of shredding sensitive documents when they raided his office in March 1990. Zahorian was charged with 14 14 counts of illegally distributing steroids and prescription painkillers, eventually convicted of providing drugs to 43 professional wrestlers, 37 of them being in the WWF. Though he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, I guess he managed to hold on to his medical license because Greg Zahorian still practices medicine as a urologist in Pennsylvania to this very day. Though WWF lawyer Jerry McDevitt was able to successfully prevent Hulk Hogan from testifying against the doctor, the Hulkster would make an appearance as a key witness at the trial of Vince McMahon in 1994. The 18-day trial was brought on after prosecutors accused the CEO, who, side note, wore a neck brace during the whole thing, of distributing steroids to his wrestlers. But as Reisman argues in Ringmaster, the feds had kinda ruined their chances from the beginning. For one, they chose to try him in New York as opposed to Connecticut, where the WWF was based. That meant they were limiting the scope of Vince's alleged crimes to matches that occurred at Madison Square Garden only. On top of that, they also kept getting dates wrong and didn't press very hard when they had the chance to cross-examine Hogan, who was more than willing to defend Vince on the stand. Even though Vince continued to hold a grudge against the man for even appearing, Reisman also revealed indications of witness tampering on Vince's end, which she says prosecutors failed to adequately address. In the end, the judge ruled that the prosecution had not provided enough evidence to prove Vince's guilt, and after dismissing the charges of distribution, a jury eventually found Vince not guilty on all counts. From there, Vince was happy to take a victory lap and default dance on his enemies in the media, doubling down on his critique of journalists like Munchnick, who he had accused of journalistic stalking in fiery rebuttals that seemed pretty indistinguishable from his Mr. McMahon kayfabe persona. Reisman summed up the era like this, quote, "The first half of the 1990s was an era of danger for Vince, but it was also an era of radical reinvention. He developed and refined a performance of sneering, entitled antagonism, not just in his promos, but under the harsh gazes of wrestling fandom, the news media, and the criminal justice system. Vincent Kennedy McMahon was thrust into an inferno. Mr. McMahon was the part of him that did not burn to ash." After approaching WWF executives about the possibility of a gay wrestling character, wrestler Chris Kanyon wrote in his memoir that he, quote, "felt he was on everyone's bad side." Kanyon felt that he had bothered Vince so much that he decided to skip out on his friend's funeral just to wrestle. He didn't want to ask for more time off because he thought it might jeopardize his career. But after learning the angle Vince had in mind for him, he instantly regretted it. Apparently, Vince's right-hand man, Paul Heyman, called him up one day and said, "Vince wants you to sing like an F-slur." He went on to tell me that they wanted me to dress like Boy George and come out of a big closet. Kanyon had been out with a concussion and hadn't wrestled for a while, so he felt he had to do it. Writing, quote, "This was the big message. I would not be doing the gay angle I wanted to do. I would be doing the gay angle Vince wanted me to do." Continuing, quote, "I had to rehearse all of it, and Vince was on hand to watch, laughing his ass off. I have never felt so small." To make matters worse, by the time the actual match rolled around, the 7-foot-tall Undertaker used a metal chair to beat Kanyon so hard on the shoulder blades that he was out of the ring again for a few weeks with yet another concussion. While Undertaker claims he had no idea Kanyon was gay at the time, Kanyon wrote that in hindsight, he believed the ordeal to be a deliberate setup by Vince. Quote, "I thought it was a message from McMahon. We don't want you or your kind here." Coming off the embarrassing display and still mourning the loss of a close friend, Kanyon sunk deeper into depression. Verbalizing his inner thought pattern, he wrote, quote, "Could I kill myself if I wanted to? Could I do it?" It was September 14th, 2003, Sunday. I hadn't been out of the house or even out of bed since Wednesday. Everywhere I looked, there was another sign of my wretched life. For 2 straight months, I had thought about ending it. My self-confidence was shaken, paranoia paranoia had set in, and I had no idea how to cope with my double life. I was lying to everyone because I was afraid I'd lose my job, yet I was losing my job too. There was no escape. I walked into the bathroom and grabbed a full bottle of sleeping pills. There were 50 pills in the bottle. That should be enough, I thought. Canyon later went on to sue his former boss over the independent contractor scam, but after the lawsuit fell through, Canyon, who had been suffering from bipolar depression, fell out of work and ended up taking his own life on April 2nd, 2010, roughly 7 years after he first grabbed those sleeping pills. Dan O'Sullivan included Canyon's death in his article analyzing the business's malpractice. In that same article, O'Sullivan lists a number of other wrestlers who suffered untimely deaths as well. Bryan Adams, Rick Rude, Randy Savage, Lex Luger, Eddie Guerrero, who suffered a heart attack at 38 and was, quote, so racked by pain in his final bouts that he could barely wrestle. He also brings up Eddie's longtime friend, Chris Benoit, who the WWE tried to scrub from the history books after he suddenly and tragically murdered his wife and 7-year-old son shortly before taking his own life in 2007. According to the medical examiner who completed the autopsy, Benoit had the brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient, quote, broad swaths of gray matter gone brown, indicating dementia. As O'Sullivan points out, Benoit was known for taking hits by metal chairs to the back of the head, as well as dive bombing into the ring head first to attack his opponents. And as journalist Irv Munchnick stated, quote, Benoit's system had been so messed up by decades of anabolic steroid abuse that he was no longer producing enough male hormones on his own and was being prescribed off-the-charts quantities of injectable testosterone. O'Sullivan points out here that Benoit had 59 times the amount of testosterone found in a regular adult male. Wrapping up his grisly assessment of early pro wrestling deaths, O'Sullivan concludes, quote, the list doesn't end. While we obviously don't have enough time to delve into all of these untimely deaths here, I do want to take a moment to emphasize a few of the more infamous ones, and how Vince McMahon's handling of them reflects the kind of person he is. After all, according to this 2003 interview, Vince doesn't seem to think he or the WWE bears any responsibility for the hundreds of young bodies the company has left in its wake.
I would accept no responsibility whatsoever for their untimely deaths, none whatsoever. As far as, and you've got that little look on your face like, geez, Vince, how can you possibly say that?
Well, but none whatsoever. I mean, they wrestled for you. They were part of your organization. They worked a couple of hundred nights a year for you. They lived this lifestyle.
Yeah, that's about the way I'd react too if I felt totally and completely not responsible for working my most talented performers to death after I refused to equip them with such lofty and unrealistic benefits as health insurance and time off. Was Vince McMahon really so outraged by the point the interviewer was trying to make here? Or is it possible that deep down he felt a tinge of remorse for the early demise of one of his top wrestlers a few years earlier? Brian Pillman was a beloved wrestler. After completing a stint as a linebacker in the NFL, Pillman trained to be a wrestler alongside the legendary Hart family before formally joining the WWF in 1996. Wrestling under the moniker Loose Cannon, Brian came up in the heat of the Attitude Era and quickly forged a legendary persona that would match his wrestling name to a T.
There's gonna be a wake! July 6th! In Calgary during the Canadian Stampede.
Brian accomplished a lot during his brief time in the WWF, but unfortunately in 1997, that time would be cut short. When Brian failed to show up to a pay-per-view match that October, Jim Cornette called his hotel to track him down. It was here that Brian Pillman was found dead in his hotel room of a massive heart attack. With no one knowing quite what to do, Brian's death was brought to the attention of Vince McMahon, who promptly made the executive decision to go ahead with that night's event Vince as planned. Then, in the middle of the broadcast, Vince would suddenly announce the shocking news to the public. Quote, "Yesterday afternoon, Brian Pillman was found dead in a hotel room in Bloomington, Minnesota." Because he did this in between the matches, audience members weren't sure if it was real or a scripted part of the event. After all, Brian was in the midst of a heated feud and had just pretended to shoot Austin on air not too long ago. This unnatural sequence of events was jarring, but sure enough, the next day, a tribute for Brian Pillman was put on by the WWF, with a lineup of his colleagues taking turns sharing what Brian meant to them. Everything at this point in the broadcast seemed respectful enough, until Vince took things in a completely bizarre and tasteless direction by interviewing Brian Pillman's widow, Melanie, live on air not even 24 hours after his passing. Now, because of copyright, I can't show you any of this segment, but I will read some of the transcript. At the top of the interview, Vince first says to Melanie, quote, "There's a great deal of speculation, obviously, when a 35-year-old man who is in competitive condition passes away. Can you please tell us, to end whatever speculation there may be, what can you tell us about what you've been told as far as Brian's death is concerned?" To which Melanie responds, quote, "Apparently his heart was put under a lot of stress for some reason. I can't really tell you for sure what that reason was, but it was an apparent heart attack in his sleep, and until the tests are back, it's kind of inconclusive right now." It was later revealed that Brian died of a previously undetected genetic heart disease, which had also led to the death of Brian's father. But of course, as Melanie states, it was impossible for anyone to know for certain at the time because it had only been 24 hours since the death occurred, may I remind you. But if you listen to Vince's line of questioning here, it seems more apparent that he's looking for any way to clear himself and the WWE of having anything to do with it at all. The camera slowly zooms in on Melanie's face, never cutting away from her gaunt expression as Vince alludes to some of Brian's past medical complications, raising the possibility that it could have been a drug overdose. He says, quote, "Brian, because of his injuries, has had to take a great deal of prescribed medicine. There's some speculation that he may have taken too much. If in fact that is proven to be the case, which it has yet to be, is there anything you would want to say to aspiring athletes that do get hurt and have to resort to prescribed medication painkillers?" Melanie replies, quote, "Well, Vince, I can't comment on whether that, well, not only was he an athlete, but he was involved in a car accident too, and he had extensive injuries from that. I think all athletes to a degree experience a reliance on pain medicine." Melanie then warns other athletes not to abuse pain medication and leave behind orphans, as Brian did. Vince immediately seizes on this and asks how, quote, "the children are taking the news, and do they understand?" Melanie says her 4-year-old son doesn't understand, but that Brian's older daughter, quote, "screamed for about 15 minutes, breaking down and uttering, quote, "I don't know, Vince, it's hard." The camera still zooming in close on her face, Vince finally asks if she's had any opportunity to think about what she will now, as a single parent, do to support her 5 children, to which she replies with, quote, "Vince, I don't even know what day it is, so I don't know what I'm going to do." Finally, by the end of the interview, Vince asks how she'd like Brian to be remembered by WWE fans all around the world, to which she states that she wants him to be remembered as a loving man and the best father in the world. She makes sure to tell Vince that he also loved the WWE, quote, "I guess you could say he lived for this business and he died for this business, and I hope no one else has to die." It is, without a doubt, one of the most disturbing clips I have ever witnessed. It's genuinely hard to sit through, and I'm perfectly comfortable saying this did not, under any circumstance, need to be shown on air. It is, to me, a testament of where Vince's mind was in the immediate aftermath of such a grave tragedy. And I'm far from the only person to call this out, with Wrestling Observer naming it the most disgusting promotional tactic of 1997, and WWE legend Mick Foley stating in 2022 that he felt Melanie should have been left alone by Vince. But Melanie faced her own share of backlash for appearing, with perhaps her most vocal critic being Brian Pillman Jr., who lashed out at his mom in 2018, labeling her a neglectful parent and stating that when he watches the interview, all he sees is, quote, "her heartlessness." At the end of the day, I still personally feel it was Vince's ultimate responsibility not to let such a segment air when it would inevitably be perceived as distasteful by those who cared for Bryan and loved watching him perform. What everyone can agree on, though, is that this was a gross display that didn't need to be milked, especially before Bryan's body was even cold. But then again, I don't think anyone would say Vince cares a whole lot about the sanctity of human life.
Title one. Owen Hart, Helmsley is mauling Owen Hart. They're gonna kill him.
Let's circle back around to the Hart family I mentioned earlier. If you don't follow wrestling, just know that the Harts are a dynasty. Hailing from Canada, the family patriarch, Stu Hart, has gone down in wrestling history for his brutal training methods, forcing all of his sons to duke it out in the infamous Hart basement that the children referred to as the dungeon growing up. But from these harsh conditions emerged some of the most legendary wrestlers that WWE has ever seen. One of these men being Bret the Hitman Hart, who found himself at the receiving end of one of Vince's most infamous moves in the history of his company. Entire videos and documentaries are devoted to this single moment, but in the most basic terms, Vince changed the outcome of a scripted match and forced Bret to drop the championship belt in Canada when he had previously refused to do so. This forced a wedge through the Hart family, with Bret urging his younger brother Owen to leave the WWF behind and join him at the only rival promotion that existed at that point, the WCW. But things were a bit more complicated than that. As much as Owen wanted to support his older brother, he was already locked into a lucrative contract with the WWF. Being one of their most popular wrestlers, Owen couldn't just leave so easily, which only made things more uncomfortable in the family once Vince proceeded to demean and mock Brent as the Mr. McMahon character on national television.
I truly believe that Bret Hart screwed Bret Hart, and he can look in the mirror and know that.
Yeah, totally just a character, guys. But if Vince had actually allowed Owen to leave his contract earlier, the tragic events of May 23rd, 1999 may never have come to fruition.
Owen Hart. Owen Hart.
Owen Hart. Owen Hart, also known as the Blue Blazer, fell 50 feet to his death while doing a stunt at a World Wrestling Federation event.
I was thinking like, man, is he going to live or is he going to die at a young age or just don't know what can happen to him. Probably won't never see his kids again.
For years, Owen wrestled under the moniker The Blue Blazer, the WWF's attempt at creating their own superhero. As the Blue Blazer, Owen Hart would battle his opponents in a blue mask and leotard, and would sometimes ambush his foes from above, using a cable and harness to dive bomb the ring from the rafters. He had done this many times, but on this particular day in Kansas City, Vince had hired some new crew members who were not as skilled in the stunt to orchestrate it. As opposed to Owen's equipment lowering him safely into the ring, the quick release mechanism on the back of his harness was opened prematurely. He then dropped 78 feet into the ring below. Owen landed on the edge of the rope and severed his aorta. He bounced back into the ring where he would begin bleeding internally. A live audience watched as Owen was taken away by a group of paramedics. Owen Hart died in the hospital that night at the age of 34. But the show kept going. While Owen was dying in the hospital, Vince made the decision to keep the show moving as normal, even after Owen Hart was pronounced dead. As Reisman wrote in her book, Vince McMahon was quick to phone Owen's wife, Martha, to inform her of her husband's condition. He told her that he had a fall, but refused to provide any further details, reportedly telling her, I don't know, before quickly uttering, someone will call you soon, and hanging up. Now, the audience in Kansas City didn't realize that they had just witnessed a man's final moments. To them, everything seemed to be going as normal. So Vince made another controversial decision. Right in the middle of the event, Vince instructed ring announcer Jim Ross to make a grim announcement. Quote, I have the unfortunate responsibility to let everyone know that Owen Hart has died. Owen Hart has tragically died from that accident here tonight. Understandably, it wasn't clear whether or not this was real, and it didn't help that Vince himself would then go on to enter the ring and finish his match as if nothing happened. It was only after the broadcast concluded that Vince scrambled backstage to address a chaotic sea of reporters. This is where he would formally confirm Owen's death himself, out of character, and would also trade a few oddly heated blows with journalists.
Well, it would appear that there were no precautionary measures taken. Why not?
First of all, I resent your tone.
I resent the sarcasm. Again,
No, I resent your tone, lady, okay?
Why
you know, this was a
no
tragic
precautionary
accident. It's a tragic accident. Don't try and put yourself in the spotlight here, okay?
What
This
were
was an
precautionary
accident.
measures
Do you understand what I'm saying?
What
An
were
accident.
precautionary measures?
For over 20 years, Martha Hart has adamantly blamed the WWE for her husband's horrific demise, slamming the organization's negligence and overall controlling of the narrative, not to mention Vince's disgusting move to continue the show after his death was confirmed. As she told a Vice documentary crew in 2020, quote, "The fact that they didn't stop the show is just appalling. Vince McMahon is a poor leader, and he failed because that talent was looking for leadership and he failed him." According to what she told CBS Sports, Owen trusted Vince to hire the right people and to make sure the stunt went smoothly. Quote, "He thought for sure they were hiring people that knew what they were doing. He was putting his life in their hands and they didn't care, blasting the use of unqualified personnel to pull it off." Martha took the WWF to court at the time, where they were eventually forced to pay the grieving widow a settlement of $18 million over wrongful death, with Martha then setting aside millions of that cash to establish the Owen Hart Foundation, which currently offers scholarships and housing to those with limited resources and unlimited potential, according to their Facebook page. The tragedy of Owen Hart remains one of the darkest moments in WWE history. The entire story reeks of Vince's gross negligence. From the gravely irresponsible move to work with those who had little experience in rigging the stunt, to his mind-boggling decision to keep the night going as planned. It's hard to imagine that Vince cares about anything other than preserving his bottom line. A disgusting example of Vince putting the brand over human life, but it was far from the first time he'd done it.
But first, he was a legend in the wrestling ring tonight. He's accused of murder. The family of the woman he's accused of killing now talking about her death.
The Fiji-born Jimmy Superfly Snuka was once a WWF legend. During the days of Vince Sr., Jimmy Snuka was massively successful and brought a great deal of money to the business. He, quote, brought an attitude to the altitude above the ringside and built a career spanning 4 decades on his aerial acumen and fearlessness. That's according to the bio listed of him on the WWE's official website in 2015. You'll notice it mentions a handful of his achievements, including this induction into the WWE Hall of Fame in 1996. Yet, strangely, there is no mention of what makes him relevant enough to include in this video. On January 18th, 1983, the NYPD was called to a motel in Onondaga County. It was around 1:40 in the morning when authorities responded to a report of a woman screaming. They arrived to find Snuka naked and in an extremely aggressive state. Local news reports indicate that Snuka's mistress, Nancy Argentino, was, quote, shouting hysterically and trying to get away from Snuka. The Syracuse Herald-Journal reported that Snuka refused to come out and cooperate with deputies, effectively trapping Argentino inside the motel room with him. When the cops finally forced their way inside, it wasn't an easy fight. It took several officers and 2 police dogs to subdue the massive 235-pound wrestler, and even then, they had to drag him to the police car in his underwear since he still didn't want to put on any clothes. As Reisman graphically outlined in Ringmaster, quote, an officer said Snuka grabbed Argentino by the hair when she ran out of the room and dragged dragged her face against the drywall. Her officially listed injuries included a contusion in her neck, possible fractured ribs, and an injury to her lower back. As reported by Syracuse.com, Argentino told deputies that Snuka became violent after she, quote, failed to pay attention to him while he was talking to her about the truth of God. Snuka was promptly charged with third-degree assault, second-degree attempted assault, along with resisting arrest and obstructing a governmental administration. But what is not commonly reported is that, according to the official police report found by investigative journalist David Bixenspan, Argentino had originally planned to press charges until she abruptly backed out of it, signing an affidavit stating that she was in, quote, no way seeking prosecution against the wrestler. As the police report outlined, quote, Vince McMahon tried to talk her out of making the claim against Snuka. Jimmy Snuka had all his charges dropped in April of that year after accepting a guilty plea for harassment. Instead of facing any actual jail time, though, Snuka, quote, received a 1-year conditional discharge in Salina Town Court, was forced to apologize to the sheriff's office, and to make a donation of $1,500 to the Ronald McDonald House. And that was basically the end of that. Argentino never pressed further. Snuka continued wrestling. The WWF kept making money off of him. Then, on May 8th, Reisman writes how Argentino called to wish her mom a happy Mother's Day. But that night, instead of going over to see her parents, paramedics would find Argentino dead. Jimmy Snuka changed his story multiple times after dialing 911. What he first told paramedics was that he and Argentino, quote, must have wrestled a little too much the night before when he pushed her over and she hit her head. He said she had been acting fine immediately after, but found her unconscious when he got home the next day. According to Reisman, this is the account he gave to 3 employees at that emergency room. But that story would change when he began telling police that actually the 2 of them were riding in the car together when Argentino got out to use the restroom. On her way back into the car, he says she tripped and hit her head on the pavement. What's interesting about that account, however, is that one of Snuka's friends, who was trying to defend Snuka in the documentary, accidentally slipped up and revealed that while he was in the car with the 2 of them, he had no recollection of them stopping on the side of the road for a bathroom break, as Reisman reports. The medical examiner didn't seem to believe it looked like a mere accident, though. Concluding the autopsy, they wrote, quote, I believe that the case should be investigated as a homicide until proven otherwise. To make matters even stranger, Reisman also raises the possibility of Vince having a conversation with authorities while they were in the midst of interviewing Snuka. Supposedly, Snuka was there with another wrestler, Don Morocco, who received the call from Vince before turning the phone over to the sergeant. According to Morocco's own account, Morocco, who frequently faced off against Snuka, by the way, was pretty open about how he felt regarding a potential murder investigation into his kayfabe enemy, selfishly admitting, quote, I didn't want to lose my golden goose because there was a lot of money down the road to be made. What was said during that alleged phone call between Vince and the cops, if it ever happened, remains a mystery, just as the contents of the suitcase that Vince and Snuka brought into the DA's office on the same day Vince made his first payments to his dad to acquire the company will remain a mystery to the end of time. Reisman did quite a bit of poking around in this story, though, and was told by then Chief of Police Fred Conger that, quote, nobody really knows exactly what happened when Argentino got injured. I don't want to sound unsympathetic, he added, but Argentino had been running around with Snuka for a number of years and had had problems with him, but continued to stay with him. That's not a new story, I guess, but it doesn't paint her as an innocent victim. Whether a statement like that might speak to an underlying sentiment that was felt by other authorities tasked with solving the case is up to you to determine. What we know for sure, though, is that despite how he should have been a prime suspect in the suspicious death of a woman he had already been charged with abusing a few months prior, Snuka was never formally investigated for the murder of Nancy Argentino. No charges, no anything. At least not until 2015, over 30 years later, when new evidence prompted authorities to take a second look at the case. Only by that point, point, Snuka was in his 70s, his brain completely destroyed by dementia after decades of being beat up in the ring. And in 2017, a judge dismissed the case on the grounds that the former wrestler was unfit to stand trial. Turns out he was just days away from death anyway. On January 15th, 2017, Jimmy Snuka died at the age of 73. His passing was met with glowing tributes from megastars across the WWE, including Triple H, Stephanie McMahon, Jim Ross, Hulk Hogan, and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who expressed his love for a man he considered family. But Argentino's family hardly received the same treatment. Reisman writes how Argentino's sister remembers her mother getting a phone call from someone high up at the WWF, possibly Vince, trying to hand them a payoff of $25,000. While the family mourned, Snuka was back on TV in a matter of weeks. And while Argentino's family filed a wrongful death suit and was granted $500,000 by the court, Snuka failed to make even a single payment, all as he continued business as usual. His character making regular appearances on the Hulk Hogan cartoon I mentioned a while ago. The WWE quietly removed him from their Hall of Fame after the charges were reopened in 2015, but who cares? He's still a legend in the eyes of these guys. Whether Vince had any role in covering up a murder will likely never be proven definitively, but that note in the police report about him asking Argentino not to press charges months before she would turn up dead is incredibly damning to me. Because after all, sometimes within the WWE, cover-ups come just as natural as the wrestling itself. Convicted sexual predator Jeffrey Epstein once referred to himself on tape as Donald Trump's closest friend.
So how do you know this?
This, of course, being in addition to Trump's well wishes for another convicted sex trafficker, Ghislaine Maxwell.
But I wish her well. Whatever it is.
And these aren't the only creeps he's palled around with. There's his former spiritual advisor, who was just indicted on sex crimes recently, and there's his new Secretary of Education, who is currently being sued for fostering an environment where child predators could thrive within the WWE.
Well, hello, Milwaukee. And good evening, America.
After serving as co-owner of the WWE alongside her now estranged husband and running her own unsuccessful campaign for Congress, Linda McMahon couldn't bring herself to leave the realm of politics behind. During the 2016 election cycle, she and Vince dumped millions of dollars into pro-Trump super PACs, spending an obscene amount of money on attack ads against Bernie Sanders before Linda was selected to lead the U.S. Small Business Administration in 2017, a role she served for 2 years before stepping down and becoming the chairwoman of one of the biggest pro-Trump PACs in the country. Linda alone invested over $16 million into his re-election, making her his 8th largest individual donor. It's undeniable that Donald Trump owes the McMahons a great deal of gratitude. Apart from Vince granting the Don plenty of positive PR during the famous Battle of the Billionaires WWE storyline in 2013, the McMahons have offered a lucrative source of financial backing for about 10 years now. So it makes sense that he's now awarding the wrestling magnate her own spot in his second administration, albeit the chair of a department he intends to destroy. I have no doubt that Linda will do anything and everything she can to fulfill the president's wishes if she ever gets the chance. But after being named in some recent lawsuits, Linda might have a little bit of an awkward time dealing with the press going forward.
Mrs. McMahon, you have been named in a lawsuit, which alleges that you and your husband allowed for systemic and pervasive abuse of underage children to persist in your business for years. It is an ongoing lawsuit, and it alleges that you rehired a known sexual predator and you felt it was sufficient to simply direct him to steer clear of children. I am so concerned about whether sexual assault survivors on campus can trust you to support them.
Thank you, Senator. They certainly can trust me to support them.
On October 23rd, 2024, Linda and Vince McMahon were slammed by a lawsuit accusing the company of perpetuating a culture of child sex abuse within the WWF by working with a man by the name of Melvin Phillips, who they knew, quote, had a peculiar and unnatural interest in children as early as the 1980s, as outlined by the attorneys of 5 anonymous plaintiffs that claimed to have been abused while working as ring boys in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Ring boys, sometimes aged as young as 12 and 13, were tasked with setting up and taking down the ring between wrestling matches and typically came from underprivileged backgrounds, which the suit claims Phillips took advantage of. With Phillips having died in 2012, the suit takes aim at the McMahons, who, quote, knowingly allowed Phillips to exploit his position at the WWE to groom and abuse ring boys, and even in plain sight of wrestlers and executives in the locker room area, even going so far as to, quote, provide Phillips with his own private dressing room where he would use his own expensive video camera to film his sexual escapades with the children. In a 2020 Business Insider article cited in the lawsuit, journalist David Bixenspan explains that Phillips had joined the WWF as a ring crew supervisor in the mid-70s, and that, quote, it was generally known by everyone what was going on, according to one anonymous insider. Quote, the McMahons clearly knew what was going on. The article also mentions Tom Cole and Chris Loss, 2 ring boys who first came forward about their allegations against Phillips in 1992, who were 15 and 16 when the abuse occurred. Cole also accused Phillips' supervisor, Terry Garvin, and Vince's right-hand man, Pat Patterson, of similar harassment as well. What's also interesting is the latter from that group, Patterson, was later accused by Hulk Hogan of attempting to assault him on his way to his first wrestling match, which is a detail that isn't talked about very often at all anywhere other than Reisman's book, Ringmaster, which is why I highly suggest you read it. Cole told the San Diego Tribune that Melvin Phillips, quote, had a foot fetish and would play with all the young boys' feet for hours at a time, with Loss adding, quote, boys are getting propositioned and played with all the time. You sort of put up with it because you can make a lot of money.
You have no concept that any of this was going on? No idea?
No idea whatsoever. And let me say this, Larry, that it's very, very peculiar that all of these unsubstantiated charges have not gone to the appropriate authorities firstly. For instance, there are laws, federal laws, as well as state laws, that prohibit this kind of activity.
Where did this break? I mean, where did you hear about it? Who broke this story? How are the charges? Why do we know this?
Well, all I know is what I read in the newspaper and haven't been able to respond to. We've started our own investigation, our own internal investigation, trying to get to the bottom of this. We want to get to the bottom of all of this.
No one has gone to a police agency and said, I was forced to have sex?
No one has filed one single charge, not one single charge with the police, with anyone.
Concerning sexual harassment?
Concerning sexual harassment.
Have you ever heard rumors of it?
No, I mean, these are things that you don't hear rumors of sexual harassment.
You wouldn't hear that?
Wait, if in fact you have someone who may be gay, then sure, you're going to hear locker room horseplay. That's going to happen, but just that.
After Vince denied any knowledge of sexual abuse inside his organization on The Larry King Show in 1992, New York Post journalist Phil Mushnick fired back in his column where he revealed that Vince had, quote, told West Coast journalist Dave Meltzer, then me, that he had let Phillips go 4 years ago because Phillips's relationship with kids. McMahon said he rehired Phillips with the caveat that Phillips steer clear from kids. And while Vince would sue Mushnick for defamation a year later, he never once challenged the legitimacy of that call, as written in Insider. In a sworn deposition, Mushnick doubled down, stating, quote, McMahon told me that it was his great regard for children, his own personal regard for children, that made him get rid of Mel Phillips, and that Phillips was soon, quote, returned by Linda because he, quote, really missed the wrestling and really missed the scene. All Phillips had to do was, quote, stop chasing after kids. Vince. Phillips did not stop, nor did he ever face any legal repercussions. That was because no victim wanted to go up against him and Vince McMahon, who instead negotiated a deal with Tom Cole in the early 90s. He would give the former ring boy $55,000 and a chance to become a ring announcer, and in return, Cole wouldn't press charges. According to Tom's brother, Lee Cole, Linda proceeded to use Tom to get the names of other alleged victims and silence them before the media caught on. See, Lee had been hard at work trying to track down other victims who could potentially back up his brother's claims. As Reisman explained, quote, Lee had phone messages from many of the potential accusers on his answering machine. The machine had a feature whereby you could call it remotely and hear messages. You just needed a code. Tom had my code, and Tom had given Linda my code. They knew everybody I was talking to. Unfortunately, Tom Cole died of suicide at the age of 50. In his last known conversation with his brother Lee, Tom reportedly told him, quote, you know, Lee, if anything ever happens to me, please let everybody know what these people, referring to those at the WWE, did to me. With the recent 2024 Ring Boy lawsuit approved to move forward, and with the plaintiff's attorneys requesting a jury trial, we will soon see how Vince and Linda hold up under that kind of scrutiny. They've so far maintained their innocence in statements through their attorneys, but they will certainly have an uphill battle deflecting years of personal testimony and evidence from countless insiders who argue there was in fact a culture of abuse within the WWE that went unchecked by the highest executives, the most powerful executive having accusations of his own that go back decades.
At that time, you people don't understand wrestling. Nobody talks, for one. No one talks. It's a complete hush-hush world. I did go to see an attorney. I was told at that time that basically this was going to come down to my word against his because I had no proof. I had to weigh that.
One of the darker Vince McMahon stories to resurface over the last couple of years pertained to allegations made by a referee who joined the Federation in the summer of 1984. As Reisman recounted, Rita Chatterton first got into wrestling thanks to her brother, who had dreams of joining the industry before dying in a car accident at just 18 years old. Rita wasn't physically built to be a wrestler herself, she admits, but she did decide to pursue the unprecedented become the WWF's first female referee. After 2 decades in the position, Rita had done well for herself, and in 1986, she approached Vince for a pay raise. He agreed to entertain the idea and suggested they meet privately to discuss the details. Rita claims that the two of them were sitting in a limousine together, alone, when he dangled a high-paying position over her head. In order for her to get the job, though, she would need to please him sexually. Rita claims that he exposed himself and tried to force her head onto his crotch. According to Rita's friend, who corroborated the claims with New York Magazine in June 2022, she made it known that she wasn't interested in doing anything sexual with Vince. She claims that he then pulled her on top of him, forced her jeans off, and took advantage of her. As Rita Chatterton told Reisman, Vince said, quote, if I wanted a $500,000 a year contract, that I had to satisfy him. He could make me or break me, and if I didn't satisfy him, I was blackballed. That was it. I was done. One of the things that sticks with me, and always will, was after he got done doing his business, he looked at me and said, remember when I told you not to mess with any of the wrestlers? Well, you just did. Before sitting back with a big grin on his face, Vince just started laughing at her. These allegations didn't come to light until 1992, after Rita's parents had passed away. The reason she didn't come forward sooner, she explains, was because her parents were going through a lot of health complications at the time, and she didn't want to make things harder for them.
At the time, my mother was on oxygen 24 hours a day. My dad had a bad heart. And I didn't think either one of my parents could have been put through it.
Although he was eventually ordered to pay Rita presumably millions of dollars in a court settlement, Vince has denied these allegations for decades. But when asked about Rita in a recent Netflix documentary, Vince had a very, very peculiar answer.
It was consensual, and actually, had it been a rape, the the statute of limitations had run out.
Rita, of course, is not the only person to accuse Vince of sexual misconduct. 2 separate tanning salon employees accused him of groping them in 2006 and 2011, respectively, and in February 2024, Vice published a previously undisclosed statement made by the late wrestler Ashley Massaro, who worked for the WWE from 2005 to 2008 before her apparent suicide in 2019. And I will be reading her statement verbatim. Quote, "During my time with the WWE, I had observed Vince McMahon making out with other divas in the locker room, but he never paid attention to me, and I assumed I wasn't his type. This changed after my Playboy cover was released. I was fortunate enough to be allowed to fly on the company's jet and stay at the same hotels as the executives for a period of time so that I could get home faster to spend more time with my daughter. On one of these occasions, Vince was attempting to get me alone with him in his hotel room late at night, and I felt extraordinarily uncomfortable. He began calling the hotel room phone and my cell phone nonstop. I called Kevin Dunn, a WWE manager, to explain the situation, and he said I should tell Vince I wasn't feeling well and would see him on TV the next day, so I did. Immediately after that night, Vince started writing my promos for me. Vince doesn't write promos for female wrestlers, that is the job of the creative department, and he certainly wouldn't have, under any normal circumstances, written promo for me. But he did, and the promos were written with the clear intention of ruining my career. I brought the first script Vince wrote for me to the WWE employee in charge of creative at the time, Michael Hayes, and he said, "You're not saying this. Who wrote this?" And I told him that Vince did. He said, "Well, kid, these are the breaks," meaning that Vince wanted to end my career and destroy my reputation on my way out. He is known for this type of behavior and did this to Redacted upon her departure from the WWE. In addition, after that night, each time I walked by him, he would make vulgar sexual comments that were clearly designed to make me uncomfortable. Ashley's statement speaks to a culture of sexual abuse that many say permeated the offices of the WWE thanks to the big boss allowing it. 2 years before Ashley's words ever came to light, in 2022, Vince found himself the subject of a bombshell Wall Street Journal article that revealed a massive investigation by a WWE board into a secret $3 million settlement that Vince agreed to pay a paralegal whom he allegedly had an affair with in 2019. The investigation found that not only had Vince spent $12 million of his own money to silence the claims of 4 women, 2 of which had accused him of sexual misconduct, it also implicated another WWE talent executive by the name of John Laurinaitis. According to the board, Vince gave one woman, quote, "like a toy" to Laurinaitis. Shortly after this story went public, Vince announced that he was retiring from his position as CEO of the WWE. He unsurprisingly made no mention of the investigation in his tweet announcing the departure, going on to state in a press release that, quote, "As I approach 77 years old, I feel it's time for me to retire as chairman and CEO of the WWE. Throughout the years, it's been a privilege to help WWE bring you joy, inspire you, thrill you, surprise you, and always entertain you." And just like that, one of the biggest titans in sports entertainment who had withstood over 4 decades of investigations, backlash, and public scrutiny, the man who shaped professional wrestling into what it is today, was gone from his post. It was a shocking revelation that sent ripples throughout the sports world, a decision that was soon reversed when he made his grand return to the WWE in January 2023, showing off his unhinged Walt Disney-like new look. I mean, I know he always did say he was the Walt Disney of professional wrestling, but he genuinely looks like Satan here. Vince was later appointed executive chairman of TKO Group Holdings when the WWE merged with fellow known feminist Dana White's UFC in September 2023. The hush money investigation kind of fell out of the purview for many people, I guess, as this was also around the time he was tapped to appear in his own Netflix documentary, except production would need to be delayed after major news broke in early 2024, when Vince was accused publicly of an entire swath of sex crimes outlined graphically in a 67-page lawsuit filed January 25th, 2024, later amended, making it 104 pages long. And I will warn you, before we look into the contents of this case, the details are gruesome. In 2019, Janelle Grant was living in the same apartment building as Vince McMahon's penthouse duplex. The two first came into contact during one of the lowest moments of Janelle's life. Her parents had just passed away, and after devoting years to around-the-clock caregiving, the lawsuit states that she was unemployed and struggling financially, her parents' home being lost in an apparent bankruptcy. She began doing some volunteer work for neighbors as a way to build up her resume, and it didn't take long for the apartment's resident manager to catch wind of this. The manager then reached out to Vince McMahon and informed him of Janelle's situation. She explained the hardship Janelle was facing and asked if he could help her with a fresh start. Vince responded with an enthusiastic hell yes. It was here that Vince introduced himself to Janelle, charming her with the prospect of coming to work for his multi-billion-dollar empire. Vince showed her plenty of attention, even gifting her VIP status at that year's WrestleMania, not too dissimilar from those state officials he schmoozed decades prior. But as the lawsuit states, quote, what seemed like a dream in the spring of 2019 quickly became a nightmare. Vince was becoming increasingly less considerate of Janelle's boundaries, her attorneys insist. Wearing nothing but his underwear during meetings that were supposed to be professional, along with touching and hugging her, Vince would also spend hours divulging personal details about his life to Janelle, the lawsuit asserts. It also states he wanted their closeness kept a secret and would frequently intimidate her by bringing up his endless legal resources he could weaponize against someone who did not do as he asked. Similar to what Rita Chatterton alleged in the 90s, Janelle claimed that she was offered a long-term position at the company on the condition that she engage in a physical relationship with the CEO. As such, the lawsuit states, quote, she felt trapped in an impossible situation, submitting to McMahon's sexual demands or facing ruin. Ms. Grant feared she had everything to lose and faced negative consequences no matter what happened. Janelle eventually succumbed to the pressure of a physical relationship though, and was given an entry-level position as an administrator coordinator, a position that Vince had created specifically for her. She initially spent time in the WWE's legal department before being sent to the XFL, and finally winding up in the talent relations department under the control of John Laurinaitis on March 9th, 2021. The lawsuit accuses Vince of treating Janelle Grant, quote, as a commodity, offering her to other men, stating that in March 2020, Vince had begun sharing pornographic materials of Janelle with other men both inside and outside of the company. This included members of the tech team, executives, producers, and former UFC champion Brock Lesnar. Vince would allegedly request and condition Janelle to send sexually explicit content around the clock, whether he was in meetings, traveling, or running live television broadcasts. The suit states that Vince would sometimes recruit other individuals to have sex with Janelle and or both of them, as well as direct Janelle to visit Laurinaitis for sexual favors before starting the day. On numerous occasions, it states, quote, Miss Grant was directed to visit Laurinaitis at his hotel room before work to serve herself to him as breakfast. It asserts that Janelle was expected and directed to engage in sexual activity at the WWE headquarters and even during workplace hours. As her lawyers emphasized, Vince McMahon, quote, exercised complete ownership and control over both her personal and professional life. As if the claims couldn't get more horrifying, the lawsuit states that Vince would subject Janelle to acts of such extreme cruelty and degradation that she would often resort to disassociation in order to survive such encounters. One of the most disgusting examples listed is said to have occurred on May 9th, 2020, when Vince McMahon allegedly defecated on Janelle during a threesome, quote, and then commanded her to continue pleasuring his friend, with feces in her hair and running down her back, while McMahon went to the bathroom to shower off. Upon his return from the bathroom, McMahon and his friend actively resumed the threesome, which lasted over an hour and a half, while Ms. Grant remained covered in McMahon's filth. The suit goes on to list several other examples, with one being Vince and Laurinaitis allegedly assaulting Janelle behind a locked door at the WWE offices while colleagues worked at their desks. According to her lawyers, Janelle, quote, begged them to stop, but they forced themselves on her, each taking turns restraining her for the other, while saying no means yes and take it. Another extremely sinister detail listed in the suit is how other WWE executives enabled the abuse, with Nick Khan and Brad Blum mom allegedly being involved in the planning of Laurinaitis' custom suite, where Janelle was frequently exploited. Eventually, it seems Vince began to see her as a liability, or more so, he realized his unspeakable actions had the potential of hurting his business. This is when he twisted her arm into signing an NDA in exchange for cash payouts, which she eventually stopped paying. Even after she was forced out of the company, the lawsuit asserts that Vince was still trying to traffic her to Brock Lesnar as of March 2022. So far, Vince has done everything in his power to smear his accuser of being intellectually dishonest, and that the suit is nothing more than a bad faith attention grab. But Janelle's allegations are gonna be hard for even the most esteemed legal team to dismantle in court, especially since Janelle's attorneys are requesting a jury trial. Not only are the claims extremely specific and beyond grotesque, Janelle also included a variety of screenshots and text messages between the two parties. Here we can see Vince discussing the idea of pimping her out to Brock Lesnar. Here is Vince discussing sexual images she sent to Laurinaitis. And here we see an extremely graphic description of what Vince wants to do to her. The entire lawsuit is linked down below if you're interested in reading the full thing, but just know the information is overwhelming and is seemingly enough to remove Vince McMahon from any position of power he may have once held. Just one day after the lawsuit was filed, Vince officially left his position on the TKO board of directors, along with responding to Janelle's lawsuit by slamming it as, quote, replete with lies, obscene made-up instances that have never occurred, and a vindictive distortion of the truth. Whatever he means by truth there, I guess we'll have to see unfold in the courtroom. But until then, Vince is finally absent from any and all involvement in official WWE business. And now, having merged with the UFC, the organization is no longer at the complete behest of a McMahon for the first time in history. Vince McMahon, the person, may be gone, but the dark and depraved legacy he leaves behind continues to haunt American culture to this day.
Donald, what do you, as a major entrepreneur, what do you think of McMahon?
Well, you know, there's really nobody like him, and I've said this many times before, not because he happens to be listening. I say when he's not listening. There's nobody like this guy. He's a special guy. He's one of the great promoters of all time. It's an amazing, it's the greatest show on earth. It really is, to me, the greatest show on earth.
What a compliment, Vince.
Coming from Donald Trump is a tremendous compliment.
Donald Trump and Vince McMahon are two very similar guys. By ripping up the status quo, steamrolling their enemies, and leaving a trail of broken lives in their wake, they both managed to irreversibly shift world history in a way that we will continue to reel from for the unforeseeable future. They're both billionaires, both come from troubled backgrounds, both had incredibly strained relationships with their fathers, both have a number of sexual assault allegations against them, and are both completely uninterested in everything and everyone having to do with anything other than themselves. Perhaps this is why they hit it off when they met so many years ago, and still managed to maintain a close relationship later into life. Perhaps it's why Vince McMahon was one of only two people Trump would pause everything for in order to take a call from on the 2016 campaign trail. Perhaps it's why Vince was so willing to include Trump in his kayfabe illusions, bringing him along on his wild storylines and allowing the future president to play directly into what wrestling fans and American voters in general were always the most susceptible to. As Vice journalist Abraham Damian put it in a recent podcast, the WWE, quote, admits it's fake in the way that we all want politics to admit it's fake. We know these people are playing characters up there, and I think that's why Trump found such success playing this sort of character that he really formulated in front of our eyes during that WWE run. I've always personally felt that Donald Trump really enjoys running for president more than he actually enjoys being president. I mean, come on, you really think he wants to sit down and discuss bilateral relations with the leader of a country he called a shithole? No, he wants to get out there in front of a crowd of adoring supporters and gossip about the people he hates, something he seemed to embrace years before taking the Oval Office. Reisman described her book Ringmaster as, quote, a story about how a country built a man and how that man reshaped his country, a story about evil and its uses, and what you can get away with when you you sledgehammer down the walls between fact and fiction. The story of a heel. Turns out the real Vince McMahon was every bit akin to the ruthless, depraved heels he meticulously carved out in his storylines. While the courts have yet to determine his fate in the eyes of the law, Vince is currently and will always be guilty of many things. Promoting gross racial stereotypes at the height of cultural polarization, neglecting the care and well-being of the wrestlers who made him a billionaire, failing to crack down on the use of steroids within his organization, ripping apart countless families, and reshaping an entire genre of sports entertainment far and beyond what anyone could have imagined. But when it comes to reshaping his legacy as a cruel, abusive, self-absorbed megalomaniac, Vince McMahon may have no chance in hell.